We're creating a new generation of women who really wanted to make an impact based off what they have experienced in life.
That's the voice of Shalonda Spencer, the Executive Director of Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Lauren Billett. Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Before we get into the nuclear news of this week, I'd like to take a moment to comment on the leaked draft of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. I have to be honest, it's a little difficult to find the right words to say in moments like this. It's incredibly emotionally draining, it's dehumanizing, and it's really difficult to process. This is an opportunity to remind everyone listening about the intersections that naturally exist between the nuclear field and others. It's important to remember that all of our efforts for peace and security are not separate from other issues like gender equity or like climate change, for example. I also want to take a moment to remind everyone to be compassionate, not just with other people, but with yourselves. And I am very grateful to work at Ploughshares Fund for many reasons, including the fact that I have this opportunity to share my thoughts on this, and for the work that we're doing to make our nuclear field more equitable, as well as to protect the future for all of us. Thank you all for listening. Now let's shift into nuclear news. Tom, what updates do you have for us there?
Hey, Lauren. Great to see you again. Thank you very much for that important statement. Yeah, on the nuclear news, looking at the Ukraine front, Russia is celebrating its annual Victory Day, and there was speculation and concern that President Putin might use this as an opportunity to escalate the war in Ukraine. And President Putin indeed gave a speech where he defended the war, falsely portraying the invasion as part of the struggle against Nazism in Europe. But fortunately, so far, Putin has not announced any expansion of the war effort. But of course, we'll keep our eyes on that. Elsewhere, President Biden and G7 leaders met virtually with Ukrainian President Zelensky, and they reinforced their commitment to strengthen Ukraine's position both on the battlefield and at the negotiating table. The leaders have committed to phasing out their dependency on Russian energy supplies. Shifting to Iran, the European Union's Iran envoy, Enrique Mora, is scheduled to visit Tehran on Tuesday. This is what I might describe as a Hail Mary attempt from the European Union to break a deadlock and save the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And Sunday marked the 4-year anniversary of former President Trump's withdrawal from the deal. We'll have more on that soon, later in the show. And lastly, North Korea. Authorities in Seoul and Tokyo said that North Korea fired a suspected submarine-launched ballistic missile off its east coast on Saturday. And this comes as the new president of South Korea takes office on May 10th.
Thanks for that update, Tom. And what about this week's early warning? What do you have for us there?
So I sit down with Ellie Geranmayeh. She's the senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And we discuss the 4-year anniversary of Trump's withdrawal from the Iran deal and really focus on what a disaster this has been for efforts to stop Tehran's nuclear program. So please stay tuned.
Then Angela Kellett, our Hale Fellow, sits down with Shalonda Spencer, the Executive Director of Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation, to honor Mother's Day, a holiday which was originally created as a campaign for mothers to protest the war and protection of their children, a protest that continues today with the added threat of nuclear weapons. They discuss the impact that nuclear weapons and security have on women's day-to-day lives.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback always helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. 4 years ago, former President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal. And since then, Iran has resumed its nuclear program and could now be weeks away from having enough nuclear material for a bomb. If Iran crosses that threshold, there would presumably be a strong political backlash from Republicans here in Washington, as well as pressure on President Biden to take military action. But before Trump withdrew from the deal back in May 2018, Iran had been in full compliance for over 2 years. And by all accounts, the deal was working well to move Iran away from a nuclear weapons capability. Now, as we know, President Biden is trying to revive the deal, but the talks in Vienna have stalled, and some in Congress argued that the deal is not worth saving. So we at Press the Button have a simple question. After living with the deal and without the deal, which is better? To help us answer that question, we are joined by Ellie Geranmayeh. She is the Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Ellie, thanks so much for being here.
Pleasure to be with you.
After President Obama secured the Iran deal in 2015, it was enforced for over 2 years before Trump withdrew. So we had 2 years in the deal, and now we've had 4 years without the deal. It's pretty unusual to be able to experience both sides of something like this. So first question, what impact did the deal have on Iran's nuclear program while the deal was in force?
The spirit of this agreement was really being enforced, I would say, for a year before it became under attack after the US elections in 2016, when we had President Trump being elected, a person who during campaigning had vowed to undo what he viewed as a terrible agreement signed by Obama. And there almost seemed to be this personal obsession with undoing any diplomatic achievement that President Obama had managed to bring about. And really, after that, we had Europeans, Iranians, the Chinese and Russians all running around trying to figure out exactly what the US president would do. So after November 2016, this deal really went in under question and almost entered a limbo phase. Yes, US sanctions relief was in theory being provided before the US withdrew in 2018, but almost all businesses around the world that were doing deals with Iran paused and froze their activities to see what would happen from the US administration, whose sanctions proved to be incredibly powerful under the Obama administration. And from Iran's side, actually, I think to the surprise of many, despite this limbo phase, Iran kept actually implementing its side of the bargain. Even a year after the US administration left the agreement, they were abiding by the terms of the deal. It was only when the US started to really tighten the sanctions enforcement policy, particularly targeting Iran's oil trade, that Iran started to withdraw from its obligations, inch by inch, and then more significantly so as the so-called maximum pressure campaign from the US really spiked up. And what we had was these tensions on the nuclear front spewing over everything, including regional tensions with attacks that are highly contributed to Iran into Saudi Arabian oil facilities, with the Yemen war ramping up, with attacks from Houthis on the ground against Saudi Arabia. We had the US president boasting about assassinating the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, which led to a very intense period where people were very afraid that, the Middle East could really be lit on fire because of this move. So having experienced and worked on this agreement when we had the US in the agreement, when the US was trying to champion diplomacy as a method for resolving its differences with Iran, where the US was doing things with multilateral backing with its allies in Europe on board, to then going to an environment under the Trump administration where essentially he wreaked havoc, not just on the nuclear farm, but also in terms of the approach to Iran in the region with this maximum pressure pushback. He divided the US from longstanding allies in the European Union and also the United Kingdom, and essentially, in some ways, really cornered the United States. Some would say embarrassed the United States on the global playing field when it came to the UN Security Council, where US's own allies essentially refused to support its move to really damage the deal through that so-called snapback attempt at the UN Security Council, where Trump's last attempt to really pull the rug under the deal failed because Europeans and other countries at the Security Council refused to go along and accept this parallel reality that the US had lived in, which is that the deal is dead. And so now, under a Biden administration, there's been a lot of efforts to try and get the US to rejoin that diplomatic path. And, we can go more into it, but clearly we're coming up to we are at the 4-year anniversary of the US having, withdrawn from this agreement. And we can see that a nuclear agreement that contained Iran's activities, that gave the world enough time, much more time, months more time than we have now to react should Iran decide to weaponize its current nuclear program, provided a much more stable environment for global affairs than we have today.
And given the experience you just went through of life with the deal and life without the deal, what advice would you have for the Biden administration, which now seems to be struggling to decide, how much political capital to spend on reviving this deal? What does that historical experience say that the Biden administration should do now?
Well, Biden should have rejoined the deal yesterday and the year before that and a year ago. And I mean, the people who have really watched the saga around this nuclear program and the JCPOA itself unfold over the years know how many years and years, 2 decades almost of diplomacy has gone into making this agreement possible. The Europeans fought very hard for the 4 years under Trump to salvage this agreement, with the hope that if a Democrat were to take office, that they would rejoin the agreement quite swiftly. And I think those hopes that have been dashed by the approach of the Biden administration. I think President Biden has to really now think carefully as we approach a very, accelerated Iranian nuclear program, which over the summer could mean that Iran's so-called breakout capability, the time that it takes to create a nuclear bomb, could drastically reduce from its already short length of weeks to a matter of days. And, this has happened under President Biden's watch. And yes, President Trump was the main party at fault for withdrawing the US from the agreement, but President Biden has been given a long window to correct that and have a course correction for this US policy. And instead, what we've had is essentially a continued maximum pressure policy that has failed to contain Iran's nuclear program, that has instead created a momentum in Iran's nuclear activities where we're reaching a very short breakout capability that's going to leave the US with that same decision point that President Obama came to in 2010, 2012, which is, do we go for a military option or do we go for a diplomatic option to contain Iran's nuclear program? And for a president who has ran on the mantra of ending the never-ending wars, the option of going down the coercive military kinetic route does not seem to be one that will play to his base. And instead, I think to preempt that hard decision, there is now a window for the US to really take a courageous political move to sign off on the last remaining bilateral issues between the US and Iran that need to be made on a matter of politics rather than policy, and see this deal through to the finishing line.
Ellie, thank you so much. We're out of time. Hope to have you back on soon to talk about this issue when it maybe is in a happier state. But thanks again for being here today.
Thank you, Tom.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Ploughshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Ploughshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to ploughshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
As we take the time to celebrate Mother's Day this month, it's important to note the impact nuclear weapons insecurity has on women's day-to-day lives. Oftentimes, women and children are the ones subjugated to the burdens of conflict and war. Their voices are frequently ignored, which is one of the reasons Ploughshares Fund is working to include the voices of those often marginalized, including women, and where we are dedicating this week's main interview and last week's Unmute Yourself event to celebrating those who mother. As Abigail Disney shared in last week's Unmute Yourself event, Mother's Day was created as a campaign for mothers to protest the war for the protection of their children. As we know, the holiday has since been refocused, but the cause of that original protest continues on, now with the added threat of nuclear weapons. Today I am joined by Shalonda Spencer, the Executive Director of Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation, known by its shorthand, WCAPS. Shalonda, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always great and a pleasure to have Ploughshares as a supporter of the organization.
I'd like to start by asking, how do existential threats like war, climate change, and nuclear conflict impact women?
These issues impact women in so many ways. And one way we've seen that is recently with the Russia and Ukraine invasion. And what we witnessed on national television and through so many news articles is that the regional displacement and permanent regional displacement for women and girls, and also the psychological effect that it has. And what I mean by that is that women have been forced to leave their homes, their homelands, their regions, because they were impacted by war and climate change and nuclear conflict. And so they are becoming now refugees where they are struggling to figure out, how am I going to live? How am I going to take care of my family? Some of them no longer have husbands due to the war because they are fighting in what we see as a very conflict situation. And so I just feel like that right now that women and girls are truly suffering. Think about the mental disadvantage that it has on women, those who are pregnant. And everybody knows when you're not in a healthy environment, it will, transfer down to what you're carrying in you because your child feels that. And so it's just a whole lot of issues that right now women and girls are facing, especially women of color, because at the borders, some of them have not been able to cross because of the racial injustice that also takes into effect when it comes to refugees, and people are not seeing women of color as as human beings. And so those are some of the issues that I see when it comes to the nuclear conflict with women.
Historically, women have been excluded from the peace and security process. Although women are in leadership positions in this field, we know that those barriers still exist. Can you tell us about the progress that's been made and what still needs to be improved?
I'll say for the progress that's been made, we have seen historically the Biden administration change narrative that women of color could not, sit at the table. And what I feel like WCAPS play a part in that is because we've successfully had women and girls to be appointed to the administration, younger and an older generation. But I think that we still have a lot of work to do, because what I'm seeing in the NGO space and what I'm still seeing in State Department and other entities is that there are not a lot of women of color in power positions where they can truly influence a change. And what we do know is that women oftentimes, when we see war and conflict, we think about everything as a whole and we don't, think tunnel vision. And then there was an article that I read where women see issues differently than men do. And we appreciate the fact that we are now being part of these conversations, but now we want to be not only a part of the conversation, but we want to be at the table of the conversation. And I think that's the improvement that we really, truly need to make.
Organizations like WCAPS has been at the forefront of this effort by highlighting young professional women in this field and by giving them a platform and community, which is so important. What are you seeing in this next generation of experts?
What I'm seeing in this next generation of experts is how we are redefining what an expert is. Since I've been back in the field, one question has come up oftentimes is, what is an expert? How do you define yourself as that expert? And what we've seen is a traditional way of expertise, meaning you see the people who have the degrees and they go to be FSOs, they come from the traditional route in this foreign affairs and nuclear space. However, there's still a certain expertise that we often omit, and that's the experience. People's life experiences can also be experts in this field, with the addition to the education component. And so what I feel like right now in this next generation, from conversations that I've had with so many women of color and girls, and how they got into this space due to a recommendation of joining the WCAPS network, through a job placement they were able to receive, and so forth. Some of them have stumbled into this field and they've grown to love it and enjoy it. And I think the more they see people like us at the table and, at the round tables, also TV and television and the news, and being experts, not just by the education component, but also saying, hey, this is what has happened to me. These are the stories that I'm hearing, and these are the stories that need to be told so people can understand that it's not all about expertise, but we're creating a new generation of women who really wanted to make an impact based off what they have experienced in life.
This next generation cares about a multitude of issues: climate change, gender equality, civil rights, voting rights, and the anti-war effort, to name a few. How do you see this next generation linking these causes with nuclear policy?
The way I see it is, we often talk about the intersectionality of all these issues, domestically, internationally, and how they all connect. And it kind of goes back into a little bit what I said in my previous question that you asked. It's about the connecting that experience. When we're thinking about the civil rights, the gender equality, we're not just seeing that happening here in America. When I first got into this role, I always say this: the first foreign issue that I had to experience was the Afghanistan one. And then it went from Afghanistan to Russia and Ukraine. And now we're dealing, what some people probably have noticed is now in America, we're back on a domestic issue of abortion. You see what I'm saying? So like all these issues are connecting in so many ways, because again, women and girls are at the forefront of every issue that I just described. And so this next generation are linking these issues, not just off of what's happening, domestically in the area, but also what's happening on the global sense. Like, how are these issues impacting my life negatively? And you see more policy papers, you see more policy briefs on them, you seeing more women speak out, whether if it's through social media. And that's the purpose of our network, making sure that we are continuing to amplify those voices because they are needed. And we really hope that, these nuclear policy issues, when wars, mass destruction happen, that we don't forget about how do we make decisions where women and girls are not impacted the most. And I think that's the question we have to start challenging our national security leaders when they're at the table of negotiation, and how they're going to make changes and think through these things. But it comes with what I always have said: more women have to truly be at the table.
We've discussed how the field has improved and what work still needs to be done. How can listeners get involved?
First, I always say, if you're not a member of WCAPS, it's always good for you to become a member or just learn about our organization. We're always looking for people to bring in ideas, be innovative, to figure out how can we better help connect with you. Our website, of course, is www.wcaps.org. And we're always looking, again, for new innovative members to truly bring forth some amazing opportunities that we can truly always, launch to our network.
Shalonda, it's been a pleasure speaking with you about this. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much, Angela. It was so great speaking with you all too.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Kellett, and in San Francisco, Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Cepedis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.